Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Findings of FRPN-Funded Projects 3, Engaging Mothers in Co-Parenting Interventions, Challenges, Characteristics of Mothers Who Engage Outcomes. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press star 0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. You may also type questions in the bottom left-hand corner. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Jessica Pearson. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm Jessica Pearson. I direct Center for Policy Research in Denver, and I co-direct FRPN. I want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and both the slides and the recording will be available on the FRPN website. Before we launch today's presentations, I want to give you a brief overview of FRPN. It is a cooperative agreement between OPRE, Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, Temple University, and CPR. It was originally a 5-year agreement. We've stretched it to 6. It's scheduled to go through December 2019. My co-director is Jay Fagin of Temple University, who will actually be one of the presenters today. And the focus of FRPN, fatherhood programs, fatherhood research, policy, and practice affecting low-income fathers. The goals of FRPN are threefold. One is to promote rigorous evaluation, and to that end, we've made 20 sub-awards to researchers and practitioners. And you're going to be hearing reports about 2 of these awards today, dealing with co-parenting. Also, the FRPN team, Temple and CPR, have conducted original research, and you're going to be hearing our research on co-parenting today as well. Another goal of FRPN is to build evaluation capacity, and these webinars are part of that effort. This is our 16th webinar, and all of those webinars, again, are noted on our website with recordings and slides. Finally, we're committed to disseminating information, and we have a comprehensive website, FRPN.org, and please visit and subscribe to our newsletter, an online newsletter, which has about 4,000 subscribers. We send out an electronic bulletin that keeps you apprised of our activities and other new research in the field. So those are some of the key features of FRPN. Why are we doing this today? I want to set the stage for the webinar today. There's many of these trends you're aware of, the dramatic increase of non-marital births to over 40%, and in some subgroups, ethnic racial groups, much, much higher. Growing number of unmarried non-resident fathers, estimated at 1/6 of all fathers, and the fact that 23% of children now live in single mother households. We have the documented drop-off of unmarried father involvement soon after the birth of their children, and the desire of many low-income, non-resident fathers to be more involved with their children. That's something we've documented at CPR and virtually all of the research and surveys we've done for nearly 30 years, and Kathy Eden and Tim Nelson eloquently document in their qualitative work on this this population. We've got growing evidence that low levels of non-resident father involvement is associated with a variety of negative outcomes for children, and that some of those effects can be encountered by greater positive father engagement with children. Those deal with social, emotional competence, peer relations, behavior problems, academic achievement, and others. We know that also that strained relationships with the child's mother are the primary reason for non-resident fathers not being more involved with their children, and that nevertheless there are mixed research results on co-parenting and the impact and its impact on behavior. The PACT evaluation, which looked at over 5,000 fathers randomly assigned to treatment and control groups, found that father-only interventions that had a co-parenting component had no impact on co-parenting behavior or father-child contact. On the other hand, an FRPN-funded meta-analysis conducted by Aaron Holmes and Alan Hawkins of Brigham Young found strong that there were significant effects on co-parenting behavior. Some research suggests that co-parenting interventions might be more effective if both mothers and fathers are involved, and nevertheless, it's challenging to engage parents in co-parenting interventions, particularly getting mothers to participate. Accordingly, FRPN funded investigators two research projects and researchers to examine mother engagement and in co-parenting interventions, and that's what we're going to turn to now. Our first presentation will be by Sarah Witten and Kim Sperber, and they'll be talking about engaging mothers, attempts to engage mothers in a co-parenting program offered through Talbert House in Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. After that, you'll hear about Armin Perry's work in Kentucky to engage mothers in a co-parenting intervention associated with a large-scale fatherhood program, and Armin uses a randomized controlled trial for his studies. Finally, Jay Fagin, co-director of FRPN, will report on mother engagement in co-parenting interventions, a little bit about sort of a smorgasbord of research results dealing with characteristics of mothers that are willing to engage, the outcomes, and some of the outcomes for mothers and fathers based on pre and post program assessments. And we'll wind up with some comments from our discussant, Jeff Johnson, President and CEO of NPCL, who's sort of part of the DNA of the responsible fatherhood movement, and then we'll move to questions. Please use the submit your questions online in the Q&A box. We're going to hold them though and take them at the end. At this time, I'm going to turn the program over to Sarah and Kim to start with the Talbert House evaluation. Sarah?
Thank you, Jessica. So as Jessica said, my name is Sarah Witten from the Psychology Department at University of Cincinnati, and I'll be talking about work that I did along with Kim Sperber, who is at the Center for Health and Human Services Research Department at Talbot House. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to advance this slide. Here we go. All right, so based on all the reasons Jessica was just giving, kind of supporting the potential utility of co-parenting interventions, the ultimate goal of our work was really to increase mothers' involvement in dyadic co-parenting services with non-residential fathers. And we did this with Talbot House, which is a community-wide nonprofit network of services throughout Southwest Ohio that focuses on prevention, assessment, treatment, and reintegration. And Talbot House's Fatherhood project has been running for 18 years, and it serves low-income, non-custodial, and custodial fathers seeking to improve parenting skills and access to their children. And it provides fathers with an array of services, including case management, legal services, employment services, and nurturing father classes. And starting in 2013, all the men in the Fatherhood program were also offered standard co-parenting services, which included an initial individual session for the father with a male co-parenting coach. And that male coach would then invite the child's mother to attend co-parenting services. If she agreed, the coach would have an individual session with the mother, and if both parents would agree, they would have a joint co-parenting session with the co-parenting coach. But the issue was that very few fathers partook in these co-parenting services, and among those who did, less than 15% of the mothers agreed to participate with them in the joint co-parenting services. So our aim of our study was to assess whether we could improve mother and father engagement, participation, and satisfaction with dyadic co-parenting services by offering what we called an enhanced service. And in this service, we tried to address some of the key things that we thought might have been barriers to mothers participating. So in particular, we had a female co-parenting coach who would invite the mother personally and would really stress that part of these services would really be dedicated towards the mom, including all moms would be offered a mother's group where it would be only mothers who would attend. And that would be a support group and also involve some curriculum addressing maternal gatekeeping and just ways that could get in the way of optimal child outcomes. And then after that, dyadic co-parenting skills training would be offered to the mother and father by both a male and a female co-parenting coach. And so we designed a nice little randomized clinical trial to compare these enhanced co-parenting services to the standard co-parenting services. However, we ran into very significant recruitment challenges. Unfortunately, we were simply unable to recruit fathers and particularly mothers into the services from fall of 2016 to the fall of 2017. And about halfway through, to try to improve enrollment, we switched to an open trial design where we offered everyone the enhanced co-parenting services. But unfortunately, this didn't improve our enrollment rates. So as you can see in the slide, out of an initial 97 fathers, only 38, so less than 40%, attended an initial meeting to discuss co-parenting services. And out of those, only 23 attended one or more co-parenting sessions. So that was less than a quarter of the fathers got those co-parenting services. Then we also had very little success recruiting mothers. One interesting thing we learned was that out of the 97 fathers, only 45 were able to give contact information for a mother, and 5 of those gave contact information for 2 mothers. So we had a total number of 50 mothers that we could reach out to. Then out of those, only 5 or 10% agreed to participate, and of those, only 4 actually participated in any co-parenting sessions. So because of this, we really had to revise our study aims. We kept our overarching aim of trying to figure out, increase mothers' involvement in co-parenting services. But here, our revised aim was to explore why it's so difficult to recruit fathers or mothers into co-parenting services and generate ideas for improving recruitment rates. So our design was to conduct qualitative interviews with 30 of the non-residential fathers and 16 mothers, varying between those who had accepted services and who hadn't, to gather information on barriers to engagement in the co-parenting services, suggestions for improving engagement. And then we use thematic analysis to code themes regarding those two topics. And we also supplemented those open-ended responses with some quantitative items where participants were asked to check off which of a number of different potential barriers they felt were big reasons or small reasons for not participating. So if we look at the results, first, from the qualitative interviews with fathers, the themes that emerged are shown on the slide here. And 83% of fathers mentioned that a large barrier to participation was time constraints, simply being too busy, and many men mentioned issues related to employment, kind of conflicting with time. So work hours conflicting with times when sessions could be, but also many men who were unemployed were spending their time seeking jobs or wanted to have a job before they would start working on the co-parenting relationship. A second theme was that over half of the men mentioned that the mother would just be unwilling to participate with them. Now, one interesting piece of this is that only 2 of the men actually asked the mother, who refused, but the rest assumed and felt very strongly that the mom would be unwilling to participate. Now, somewhat unexpectedly, almost half of the men reported that a big barrier were communication challenges with Talbert House staff. And the men mentioned inadequate follow-up by the case managers, not being able to reach staff when they were trying to return their calls about co-parenting, and some inconsistent messages from staff about what exactly the co-parenting services would look like and what the procedures would be. Now let's turn to the results of the qualitative interviews with mothers. And a few different themes emerged. First was mother distrust of the Fatherhood program. So many mothers were expressing real skepticism that a program that was designed to serve fathers could really be trusted to represent and serve the mother's or sometimes their child's best interest. So an example quote here is, the program had already been working with my child's father, and in my and my attorney's opinion, he already had a relationship with program staff and I didn't. Another theme that emerged was frustration with fathers, including things like inconsistent or ineffective parenting and father's anger issues. So an example quote here is, I know how close-minded he is, and I don't see that changing. He's the fun-time dad, but if she's sick and needs medicine and I can't afford it, then he doesn't want to help. I can count on one hand how many times I ask him for help with something like that, and then he doesn't want to do that or understand why he should have to help with that. About 20% of mothers also mentioned safety concerns, where including 3 women expressed that there were current or past protection orders against the father. And many more women expressed ongoing concerns related to their child's safety as primary barriers to participation. So an example quote here is, we're divorced now. It just became final 2 weeks ago. He's a very abusive person. He was in a standoff with the SWAT team for 16 hours. He pulled a gun on me and the police officer. So many moms have some pretty legitimate reasons that they might be concerned about bringing this father back into their child's life. And finally, mothers were also mentioning logistical barriers, including an inconvenient location and having other family responsibilities like child care or caring for sick or aging relatives. And the quantitative results really echoed those qualitative themes. You can see on the slide the top 3 big reasons for declining to participate were the inconvenient location, being too busy, and not having contact with the child's father. And if we combine the big reasons and the small reasons, we see that over 70% of women said they were just too busy. Over half said they were angry at the father for things he's done to me in the past. And over half said not wanting contact with the father. All right, so here I'm going to turn it over to Kim to present the rest of the results.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. What I'm going to focus on are some of the themes for improvement and recommendation. So some of the things that really have real practical value to conducting qualitative interviews from potential participants and actual participants of services, so that programs who are focused on increasing the uptake of co-parenting services can have some concrete actions or strategies that they might be able to take. So in an effort to get that kind of information from our study participants, we did ask them what they thought would result in more mothers and fathers choosing to engage in co-parenting services. When we asked father participants what the program could do to improve engagement in co-parenting services, there were 3 themes that were present for both fathers who did participate in some level of co-parenting services and fathers that did not participate in any co-parenting services. And so when we look at some of those themes, sorry, I advanced a little too far there. The first one we see is improved marketing. And so we had a number of fathers making statements such along the lines of there's not much information about the program out there. And some of the specific strategies that they mentioned that we might want to use were things like Facebook and other social media outlets to both recruit potential participants as well as share the work and success of the Fatherhood Project, distributing flyers in the community, and providing some type of mechanism for alumni fathers who had participated in the services to share their experiences. What's really of interest here is that at the time of the study, the Fatherhood Project was using some of these strategies already, and yet we still had perceptions among participants that that was not sufficient. And so that was really some immediately actionable information that the program could use for quality improvement purposes that resulted from the study. A second theme that Sarah mentioned had come out not only from the mothers but with the fathers was improving staff communication. And so some of their specific feedback included things like being more aggressive, consistent, and persistent in outreach, particularly to the mothers that they were trying to get to partake in co-parenting services. And related to that was the request that staff sort of close the loop with the fathers, meaning that the fathers would have liked for staff to have followed up with them to let them know the results of the outreach attempts with the mother, both so that they would know what was going on, but also so that if there was a role for them to play in bridging that communication gap, that they might have been able to do so. And then, as was alluded to with some of the other results, we did have a number of fathers, roughly about a third, who had shared that they sometimes experienced difficulty reaching the program staff, and so they did have recommendations about making staff more available or being more responsive to fathers who leave messages getting back in a more timely manner. And then third, we saw a number of suggestions that we were terming more meaningful inclusion of mothers. And so the fathers thought that mothers might be more likely to participate if there were activities or services that were available to mothers that allow for more meaningful inclusion into overall services. And some of the specific examples that they provided were things like having child activities that both parents could attend. And they were they really did stress that they were not talking about therapeutic types of activities, but rather fun activities that could be held in low-stress environments where both parents could be present and simply enjoy attending something with their child together as a family unit. The other thing that they, interestingly enough, had recommended was mother-only groups, which, as Sarah mentioned, actually was a feature of the enhanced services that we were trying to engage mothers into. They also talked about having individual services to mothers and fathers before presenting them with dyadic sessions. And then they also focused on some really concrete and tangible things that might be of benefit to mothers, such as gift cards and other types of assistance. When we look at the themes for improvement that the mothers offered in terms of their qualitative interviews, one of the first ones for them, or one of the big overarching themes, was a desire for services that focused on improving communication skills of the parents. So there was a lot of agreement among the mothers that parents should participate in individual services prior to doing that. So they not only had feedback about the content of services, such as focusing on communication skills, but they also had a little bit of feedback about how they thought that should be structured in terms of doing individual services prior to joint services. And one example quote we have on here from one mother is, best thing, depends on the age of the child, is if each parent does individual counseling first, then come together for counseling, and then involve the child last. Adult issues should not be discussed with the child. And that type of feedback occurred across several of the mothers. The second one was around improving service equity for mothers. So as we mentioned, there was already this perception that the program might have been for the primary benefit of fathers. And so there was a lot of requests for practical assistance that was already available to fathers who were participating in the Fatherhood Project, but were not yet available to mothers. And so some of the examples that they gave were things like assistance with food, housing, legal aid, child care, and activities for the kids, gift cards, and household supplies. So a good combination of really sort of concrete, tangible assistance were the kinds of things that mothers were asking for in terms of improvement for co-parenting services if the intent was to engage them in services. So when we look at sort of the collective results from what Sarah presented in the last couple of slides that I have covered, we do see that there are some implications for practitioners who are working in the field through existing fatherhood programs who are desiring to engage mothers into some type of co-parenting services. And we first felt it was really important to stress a couple of key points. And one of those is that lack of perceived need for help was actually not a key reason for non-participation in our particular study. And so we did find that both mothers and fathers reported relationships that were marred by conflict and low levels of parental alliance. So lacking a need for help was not a key driver. Similarly, a low perceived value of services was also not a driver of non-participation. For example, all of our interviewees were asked whether there's a need for a program to help mothers and fathers who do not live together to do a better job of raising their child together. And that item received a near universal yes response from interviewees. And also, interestingly, for the fathers who did participate in co-parenting services, every one of them indicated that they had found value in the services. So a perception that there wouldn't be value in the services was not a driver of non-participation. What did appear to be primary drivers of low engagement in our particular study that we feel are probably generalizable to other programs really kind of fall into three areas, which are sort of participant attributes, logistics, and then program attributes. And when we look at potential participant attributes, we saw a lot of relationship difficulties, but those were also combined with low levels of contact between the mother and father at the time of the study. And you'll recall that Sarah had alluded to that. We had 52 of the 97 fathers in the study who were either not able or not willing to provide the mother's contact information to staff. And so that really diminishes a program's ability to attempt to recruit women into services when the father is the conduit to the mother and they don't or can't provide that information. And then second in that context, in terms of potential participant attributes, was the mother's distrust that a father-centric program would work in her best interest and not just use her involvement to help the father with his issues. And then when we look at practical or logistical barriers, we see the things that are typically never a surprise when you're talking about community-based services and things like transportation and childcare. Interestingly enough, however, because we had such difficulties even getting initial contact with the mother, we weren't able to really discuss with her what options the program might have for helping her diminish some of those particular barriers. And then finally, in terms of the program, it was, as Sarah mentioned, there were some difficulties with formalized outreach protocols and accountability for staff in engaging in outreach and recruitment activities. So we focus on 5 recommendations here. The first, very simple, offering interventions that improve basic communication between co-parents to reduce undermining behaviors and to improve co-parenting alliance, which we found in high levels in our sample. The second was maybe the need to alter the focus of existing fatherhood programs to be more inclusive of the family in order to engage women. So we need to do something within these programs to provide women with their own reasons to come to the program, not just to supplement the father's programming. And then third, programs that have traditionally only or primarily served fathers may need to provide more comprehensive and ongoing training to staff about the differences in working with mothers and families rather than fathers only if they seek to offer co-parenting services to this population. And then finally, programs need structured communication outreach protocols for staff to use when engaging in these types of outreach activities, and that could look at things like the number of contacts, timing, frequency, documentation, et cetera. And then finally, looking at standardized processes for follow-up and reminder calls and making sure that we ensure the appropriate amount and type of outreach to potential participants, keeping in mind that we need to do that in a way that doesn't further damage what might be fragile relationships that are already in existence between the father and the mother. And so we need to take a look at how do we help staff operationalize that into concrete strategies in terms of knowing what to say to people, how to message the services, how to essentially cold call mothers, and what are the best practices for helping to get them on the phone and sell the services and bring them in the door and doing those types of things. So there's obviously a good deal of work that still needs to be done by programs that are attempting to engage mothers, and our study probably just at this point at least provides some actionable steps that programs who are interested in moving forward that could take.
Thank you, Sarah and Kim. And again, questions will be at the end of the presentation. Type them in the Q&A function. So now we're going to turn to Armin Perry to talk about father and co-parenting in the context of the For Your Child project. Armin?
Thank you, Jessica. I had a slight technical issue where I was disconnected, and so I'm working with Kat to get me logged back in as a moderator. So I think that should probably be taken care of here momentarily.
Should I advance your slides?
Okay, if you can do that, then yep. If you
sure,
can, and you can
no
advance
problem.
the slides, then I think that
okay.
works. Yep, so,
all right, let's go.
All right. So again, thank you all for joining us. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Armand Perry. I serve as the project director for an OFA-funded New Pathways for Fatherhood project that we call For Your Child. Just a little bit of background. Our project is an attempt to help dads increase their capacity for taking more active roles in their children's lives. One of the issues that we've bumped up against is the idea that our project was funded for fatherhood and the funds were earmarked specifically for that purpose. And as such, we have a prohibition on what we can do with our grant funds in terms of serving folks other than the fathers. And obviously, in the context of non-resident fatherhood, you necessarily need partnerships and alliances with co-parents in order to put the dads in the best possible position to apply whatever it is that they've learned. And so that is sort of the backdrop as to how the FRPN-funded project came about. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we were interested in doing, because time and time again, our fathers would come to us and say, you know, we enjoy the time in the program. We feel as though we've learned a lot. We feel as though we're coming out the back end different than when we went in. But in order for us to, again, as I alluded to earlier, in order for us to apply what it is that we've learned and actually be able to sort of manifest some of the things that we've learned and attempted to pour into them, they had difficulty because they had to negotiate access to their children with custodial mom who, for whatever reason, had not been a part of any intervention. And as some of my co-panelists said, may have had some skepticism about what dad's motivations were, may have had some skepticism about the level of authenticity that dad was exhibiting in terms of his new and improved version of himself post-intervention and so on and so forth. And so we saw the FRPN-funded projects as an opportunity for us to bring moms into the fold and help them to better understand the types of dedication and commitment that our fathers had made in hopes of sort of increasing the window of opportunity that moms had around being receptive to the idea of co-parenting. So the research questions that we were looking at had to do with whether or not providing mothers with co-parenting education would impact their co-parenting relationship quality, whether or not providing them with co-parenting education would influence and impact mothers' report of fathers' level of engagement with the children, and then finally, whether or not providing moms with co-parenting education would influence or impact their report of conflict resolution skills. Next slide, please. And so here you see a little bit about our fatherhood program. We provide dads with an array of services, including fatherhood-specific parent education to the tune of 28 hours. We use the National Fatherhood Initiative's 24/7 Dad, which is one of, if not probably the most popular fatherhood curricula out there in the human and social services. And so we use it. But given that all of our dads are non-resident dads, we also have supplemented it with a couple of modules from a curriculum called Together We Can. And so we end up providing our dads with 28 hours of parent education, and many of them are eligible for up to 6 months of case management services. We do the work in 4 different counties across the state of Kentucky. Jefferson County, where Louisville is, which is Kentucky's largest and most densely populated cities, but we also do the work in areas that are more suburban and maybe even rural, depending upon one sort of demographic definitions. And the other places where we do this work are Moorhead, Kentucky, Paducah, Kentucky, and Owensboro, Kentucky. Our inclusion criteria are dads have to be at least 16 years of age and up, and have one child that they at least have one child that they don't live with, and no open either DV or CPS cases. So again, with that as a backdrop and thinking through the ways in which we wanted to be responsive to what the dads were telling us, what we decided to do was take a look at our curriculum and identify the modules that we thought spoke specifically to these ideas around co-parenting And what we've done is we've packaged those and invite mothers into a one-time workshop that takes about 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours. And we just introduce them to the exact same content that we teach the dads. And you see some of the sort of highlights from the 2-hour workshop sessions on your screens now. There's a balloon activity, family wheel, and a hopes and dreams activity from the Together We Can curriculum. There are modules on what it means to be a man in family history from the NFI 24/7 Dad, discussions and conversations around showing and handling feelings with a particular emphasis on grief and loss, communication, getting involved, parenting time, and then obviously these notions around co-parenting. And again, keep in mind that what we're trying to do is we're trying to be intentional about introducing mothers to the content that dads are learning so as to sort of put them in a much better position to understand and maybe even appreciate the types of work that dads are doing around self-improvement and capacity building work from the standpoint of parenting, efficacy, capacity, and skill building. Immediately following each of the workshops, we would do focus groups where we would engage moms in discussions and conversations to get their reactions as to what it was that they had just witnessed, what it was that they had just observed, what, if any, immediate reactions they had to the content, what, if any, immediate feedback they had about what they had sort of participated in and engaged in. And then we would also offer them an opportunity to receive mediation services with a court-approved mediator at no cost. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So in terms of our methods, ours was an experimental design. We randomly assigned moms to either a treatment group where they were invited into the workshops, but we also had a comparison group with mothers who only completed surveys. We collected data at 3 different points in times. There was a pre-intervention data collection. There was a 3-month follow-up and then a 6-month follow-up. Our sample ended up being 153 with 84 moms, and that's actually backwards there, that's my mistake, 84 intervention moms and 69 control moms. And again, I've mentioned the inclusion criteria, our dads being 16 years and up, and having a child's father who was participating in our fatherhood program. Because again, we wanted to be intentional about being able to later on match our data to see whether or not there was any consistency or congruency between what dads were saying over time in terms of outcomes, and the same thing for mothers. You're looking now at some of our demographic data. On average, the mothers were a little bit older than 34 years old. You can see it's a relatively low-income group with a mean income of a little over $23,000 annually on average, a little over 2.5 children. And an important data point here is that in terms of childbearing partners, we see that on average, moms had a little over 2.5 children, and they had close to at least 2 childbearing partners. And so some of these issues related to multiple partner fertility and the ways in which they necessarily complicate parenting and co-parenting certainly are and were at play in our study. Next slide, please. Here you're looking at our frequency distributions, and you see that we're basically split between Caucasian moms and Black or African American moms, with a couple of moms reporting other sort of racial identities there. About half report working full-time, with about a third of our moms reporting being unemployed. Most of the moms have at least a high school diploma, and a good number of them have graduated college or report graduating from college. In terms of relationship status, most of our moms were not married or not dating at all. A little over a quarter of them were married to or dating the father who was in the fatherhood program, and a little over 20% were married or dating someone other than the father in the fatherhood program. So again, from a multiple partner fertility standpoint, from a new partner sort of a standpoint, for those of you all who are familiar with the level of complexity that necessarily adds to being engaged in this type of work, you can see that we had some challenges to sort of overcome there, and some of the discussion that we'll get into later on speaks specifically to that. And there, the final demographic there, you see the data around multiple partner fertility and how many, what proportion of our mothers had children with more than one dad. You're looking here at the three primary outcomes: conflict resolution skills, co-parenting relationship quality, as well as father's parenting behavior. And you can see there from the data that I presented that from a psychometric standpoint, all of these measures with our current sample are above the sort of customary 0.70 cutoff in terms of reliability. Next slide, please.
Yeah. Oh.
So here you're looking at our data around conflict resolution skills, and what you see is the blue line, at least it's blue on my screen. I would imagine that it's a blue tinnish color depending on what your resolution is. The blue line is our control or comparison group, and the sort of pink or reddish color line is our intervention group. And you see that over time, you see that mothers in the intervention group report, the way that this measure is worded, lower numbers mean higher conflict resolution skills. And so you can see that over time, the control group stays pretty much the same when you see some decent increases in conflict resolution skills for the intervention moms. And that's borne out in not only the sort of graph there, but as we look at our F statistic in terms of our ANOVA analysis, that the differences were statistically significant with small effect sizes. And again, we'll get into that in more detail a little bit later on. Next slide, please. Okay. Here you're looking at co-parenting relationship quality, and again, blue bars are control group moms, and reddish pink lines or bars represent the intervention group moms. And again, you see sort of steady across the board with the control moms, but you see increases, at least reported increases, in co-parenting relationship quality from our intervention moms. Unfortunately, they did not rise to the level of statistical significance, but certainly we're trending in the right direction there. Next slide, please. And finally, in terms of quantitative results, you're looking at now the mother's report of father's involvement. And you see basically a flip-flop. At baseline, control moms reported higher father's involvement than did the intervention moms. And then at the midway point, around 3 months, you see that they're somewhat even. And then at 6 months, you see basically a reversal with control group moms reporting less involvement from their child's father, but intervention group moms reporting more involvement from their children's father. Next slide, please. And with our study, not only did we collect the quantitative data, but as I mentioned, we also did immediate follow-up focus groups. And toward the end of the study, we reached back out to a number of the moms who participated in the workshops to do sort of a follow-up individual interview to see what, if any, influence or impact they felt like over time the intervention had on them, and if they had any additional thoughts beyond what they provided to us in the immediate follow-up. And so you're looking at some of the emergent themes there. The first one is what we call what makes a good dad, and as you might suggest, or as you might sort of suspect, this is mom sort of talking to us about the traits and qualities and attributes of what she feels like makes a good father. And there are any number of things that range from things that were traditional in nature around being a good financial provider to being there in terms of having a presence in the child's life. But many of the moms also talked about some non-traditional things related to the extent to which dad had a good working relationship with her as mom. And if that were the case, that was something that was signaled to mom that dad was a good dad, that had very little to do with his involvement with the children, but to whatever extent she felt dad was willing and able to work with her, that was an indication that he was indeed a good dad. So there were things along those lines. Also, the extent to which moms felt like dad was willing to compromise. Again, I think in one of my co-panelists' slides before, there was a mention of a dad being sort of somewhat uncompromising and really, really difficult to connect with and unwilling to listen and pay attention. And so, again, we see some similar sorts of trends in the work that's happening across projects. The next emergent theme there was what we call co-parenting outlook. And what was interesting here was that for many of the moms, their sort of perspective on co-parenting was sort of set in stone. And this wasn't the case for all of the moms, but for a sizable minority, right? Not even most of them, but for a good number of them, their perspectives on what their co-parenting relationships look like and were going to look like into the future were already sort of set in stone. And many of the moms felt like any work or any effort to try to improve dad's engagement skills or involvement skills or co-parenting relationship quality skills were sort of exercises in futility based on whatever their past or their histories were with them. But there were other mothers, most of the mothers, who had a more optimistic sort of an outlook on co-parenting. And many of these moms talked about the idea that they were excited about the opportunity to participate in the workshop because they themselves had given thought, time, effort, and energy to trying to facilitate father's involvement. And many of them, for whatever reason, those efforts had not been successful. And so for them, having sort of an independent third party stepping in and helping in that regard, they saw as a nice opportunity to try to get some help that they felt like they had already been reaching out for. Next is co-parenting challenges, and there were any number of co-parenting challenges that moms talked about in our discussions and conversations with them, things like being disrespected or whether or not dad was respectful to her as the primary caregiver. Oftentimes mom talked about feeling judged for the decisions that she made around parenting and things of that nature. Moms talked to us about what they felt like was oftentimes court-ordered participation, and there was a particular sort of resentment when dads were taking an active role in their children's lives, but moms felt like the impetus for doing so was because the courts were sort of coercing or forcing dads into it in terms of formalized child support, and if and when moms felt like dad wanted to take an active role in a child's life simply in exchange for being forced to pay child support, and moms felt like there was a sort of a disconnect there. There were also co-parenting challenges related to what moms felt like was dad's either inability or unwillingness to untangle his role as a former boyfriend or partner from his role as a parent. And when they found themselves in situations where when the romantic relationship dissolved, there was a decrease in dad's involvement with the children. So moms saw that as particularly challenging and upsetting. The next emergent theme there is mom's advice for dads. One of the things that we would wrap our focus groups up with was soliciting mom's feedback in terms of what she felt like could or should be done to help dads improve their co-parenting relationships with mothers, and moms offered us any number of bits and pieces of advice and suggestions there. Much of it related to, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, the idea of being more intentional about bringing moms into the fatherhood program earlier on, and also moms wanted sort of observational analyses as well, and even measures, right? So in other words, many of the moms talked about the idea that the best way to determine whether or not dads were absorbing and retaining the information from the fatherhood program was to be intentional about creating spaces for dads to interact with their children, and then having some sort of independent third party, whether it be a practitioner or researcher, sort of gauge or observe that interaction to determine whether or not dads were really sort of absorbing the content and the information there. And so I thought that was interesting as well that moms sort of offered that. Next is props to the program, and props is basically a colloquialism for an affirmation of sorts, right? And when this happened, mothers were talking to us about the idea that they felt really, really good about what it was that they participated in over those 2 hours in that workshop, and they felt like it was indeed exactly what the doctor ordered, so to speak, in terms of putting dads in a position to improve and enhance their involvement. We're intentional about talking about the importance of effective co-parenting, and for the mothers who feel like dad having a relationship with mom and an effective and amicable co-parenting relationship. These were things that they would echo in many cases, things that they had attempted to get dads to see and understand on their own, but for whatever reason, some of them hadn't been successful. And so having a sort of a third independent party carrying out that same message was something that they saw as favorable. And then last here is mother's reflections. And this is where I think we got probably the largest sort of takeaway from the study, where in many cases mothers talked about the idea that after going through the workshop, they were prompted to give thought and consideration to what parenting looked like from someone's perspective other than their own. And so I think that for many reasons we'll get into in a few minutes, I think that that's where there's an opportunity for us to really get into some next steps and have some movement around the work. Next slide, please. Coming close to the end here.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so some of these issues around discussion we've talked about, but just to sort of speak to them somewhat briefly, the data analysis indicated to us that messaging and recruiting mothers into co-parenting is really important. Wanted to make sure that when we reached out to moms, that moms didn't get the sense that we were reaching out to them because they were deficient or in need of remediation in any way, but indeed we were reaching out to them because we felt like they could have value added to what it was we were trying to do with fathers and trying to support them in their efforts and interests in co-parenting. So again, messaging becomes really important. The next thing is, again, consistent with some of the things that our co-panelists mentioned. There were some mothers who questioned fathers' motives and were skeptical about whether or not the work that we were doing was being sort of authentically driven by the dads who were entering to the program. And so that was sort of a challenge that we had to face and overcome, and I would imagine other folks interested in doing this work would also face as well. As I've also mentioned, with the mother's reflection theme there, one of the biggest takeaways was the idea that mothers oftentimes would talk about the idea that for the first time they necessarily stopped and gave thought to what parenting looked like from a father's perspective, which was not necessarily something they would do otherwise because they had no reason to. And the last bullet point there again, obviously our data are preliminary. We're talking about a really low dosage intervention. And on 2 of the 3 outcomes, we had statistically significant findings, but in both of those cases, really small effect sizes. And so in a way, so certainly our results should be considered as preliminary, but it does give a reason to believe that potentially higher dosage interventions may have some possible and positive implications for co-parenting. I think this is actually the last slide. In terms of implications for practice and future research, I mentioned to you all that a part of our intervention offered mothers and fathers no-cost mediation. We had very few folks to take us up on that. But what was interesting was when we followed up with people post-intervention, many of them talked about the idea that mediation is something that they felt like was important, and several of those folks wanted to take us up on the mediation after the intervention was over. And so it was sort of interesting in that regard to find people who had sort of come full circle on the idea of mediation. Second, there is just this idea that moms were giving thought to what parenting looked like from the non-resident father's perspective. I think sort of crystallizes for us the importance of emphasizing empathy and getting engaged in co-parenting work earlier on so as to sort of cut off at the pass much of the co-parenting relationship baggage and scar tissue that many of the folks that we engaged faced. Mothers wanted to know a lot more about what dads were doing, what they were learning about. For the mothers that we connected with, they actually wanted to get copies of the workbooks because they wanted to have discussions and conversations with the dads. They wanted to know what the dads were listing in their workbooks, what their thoughts and perspectives were. And again, many of these moms, it was the case that they had been sort of wanting dad to take a more active role, and they themselves had been reaching out trying to facilitate that, but for whatever reason, it hadn't been effective. So many of the moms that we connected with were really interested in being more actively involved. And the other thing that they talked about was the idea that for many of the dads, over time, moms could sort of trace the extent to which dads stayed actively involved and overlapped that with their graduation from the program. And so it was the case that for many of the moms, when dads graduated from the fatherhood program, that they noticed what they felt like was a slight dip in their sort of enthusiasm and their engagement. And so moms were interested in ways that more intensive follow-up could happen and sort of sustainability. So I think that that's all for me.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We here acknowledgments to your funders, and we're going to speed on to the last presentation, and that's by Jay Fagin about the FRPN team's co-parenting study dealing with mother engagement.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, and glad to be part of this important webinar. I'm going to go through my slides quickly because I know that we have a discussant, and we want to leave time for questions. So essentially, the focus here is on mothers' involvement in co-parenting services within the context of fatherhood programs. Low-income non-resident fathers strain relationships with the child's mother is a primary reason for not being involved with children. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware of that, and we've heard that in today's webinar. Some recent research has also found that help with co-parenting is one of the main reasons that fathers enroll in responsible fatherhood programs. But we also know that researchers and practitioners feel that a greater impact could be had if mothers were involved in co-parenting services within the context of fatherhood programs. But the experience of some programs has not been so favorable. The Parents and Children Together evaluation that recently was completed indicated that 3 out of 4 fatherhood programs tried to involve mothers, but few mothers participated. So one of the goals of our study that I'm talking about right now is to try to determine, are mothers interested in participating in a co-parenting intervention? And if so, what are the predictors, which mothers are interested in participation? And then finally, what's the effect if mothers participate on co-parenting and father-child contact? And again, these are mothers who are recruited through fatherhood programs. We used the National Fatherhood Initiative's Understanding Dads curriculum. This is an awareness and communication program for mothers so that they can more effectively co-parent with the fathers of their children. Helps mothers understand why father involvement is important. Improves mothers' awareness of how her relationship with her own father and her mother impacts her relationship with the father of her child. It helps to improve communication between the co-parents, and it increases mothers' confidence in co-parenting with fathers. This is an 8-session program. We condensed it to 6 sessions. However, we did not eliminate any of the content, so we just sort of doubled up on some of the content in some sessions. So we covered all the content that was in the 8-session curriculum. As far as the study, this is not a randomized control trial. We did not have a control group, but instead we had one group. All the mothers were recruited to participate in the Understanding Dads curriculum. We collected pre-test, post-test, and then 3-month follow-up data. We had 22 cohorts across 6 urban social service agencies, and you can see where the different sites were: South Carolina, California, New York City, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Colorado. One of the reasons that we went to all these different sites is because we kind of learned early that some of our sites were small, and we needed to have programs, sites that were serving a lot of fathers in order to get enough mothers together to participate in a co-parenting group. So mothers recruited in one of three ways. The father was recruited at first in the Fatherhood program, and he provided contact information for the mother. Mother was recruited through advertisements in local and online mothering groups, and then the mother some mothers reached out to the coordinator after hearing about the class. So we had 23 cohorts. That's 23. We administered the Understanding Dads curriculum 23 times in these various sites. For the first 9 cohorts, the mothers and fathers lived separately, and the father was an active participant in the Fatherhood program. For the next 14 cohorts, we expanded our eligibility requirements so that co-parents could live together. However, only a small number of the couples actually cohabited. It was just 17 couples out of 127, as you'll see shortly. And we also included as our criteria, fathers had to express interest in participating in the Fatherhood program, but were not actively involved at the time of recruitment. So in these latter 14 cohorts, we approached mothers, we recruited mothers, but they were only eligible to participate if the father was interested and willing to be in the Fatherhood program. So as far as mothers' interest in the program, we approached 277 mothers, were contacted for the study. 55% were interested in participating, 111 were not interested, and then 13 were ineligible for various reasons. So what predicted mothers' interest? Who was interested in this program? Well, we found that education was a predictor. With each additional level of education completed by fathers, it increased the odds that mothers were interested by 33%. By the way, the predictors that we're looking at, the factors that predict whether mother was interested, come mostly from fathers' reports of things like relationship quality and their life situations. So we also found that each additional child shared by mothers and fathers increased the chances that mothers were interested by 54%. So if they had more than one child together, mothers were more interested in this intervention. We also found that an increase that higher levels of relationship quality. This was an item that asked fathers, please rate the quality of your relationship with a mother. And the higher the quality relationship seemed to be associated significantly with the odds that mothers would be interested in participating. And it was quite a strong predictor. So fathers who reported very low relationship quality, those mothers were not interested in understanding dads. And then we found that, interestingly, if fathers were incarcerated during the past year, that increased the odds of mothers' interest. And that was actually our strongest predictor. I can only assume and guess that when fathers have been incarcerated, mothers have a lot of concerns and issues about how to involve them again in the family, how to co-parent with them, and they sought out our intervention, or they agreed to our intervention because they wanted to better understand those kinds of issues. And then we found that when fathers and mothers co-resided, mothers were less interested. So it was the non-resident couples in which mothers were interested in participating. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going on to the next slide here. So one other thing that we did find was that we found it very interesting that undermining, the extent to which fathers felt that the mother undermined him, did predict her interest, but it was only when there was a moderate level of undermining. So if there was very low undermining, mothers were not really interested in participating. If there was very high undermining, mothers were not interested. So it was sort of this middle level, the moderate levels of undermining where mothers were more interested in participating. So going on now to the results of the outcome study, as you can see here, we had 153 mothers were interested, Out of those mothers, 141 completed the pretest, and 127 mothers attended one session, and the vast majority of those mothers also completed the post-test, but we had pretty high attrition for follow-up. We also interviewed fathers, and you can see here there were fewer fathers who participated, but we had data from them as well. Our measures, we had a measure of co-parenting confidence, that is how confident the mother feels in her ability to co-parent with the father. We used a validated scale that we developed on co-parenting, which assessed co-parenting alliance and maternal undermining of the father. We also assessed co-parenting conflict, and that is items that rated the parents' perception of how much disagreement there is between mothers and fathers. And then we assessed how much contact the father has with the child. Now, one note here is that mothers who participated in the intervention had more co-parenting challenges. So there was some bias in the mothers who participated, and it tended to fall in the category of mothers who felt there was more challenge. They were the ones who were more likely to participate. In a way, that's a good thing, because we want mothers who have greater need to participate in these interventions. So what were the results? This is just pre-test to post-test. We found that there was a significant effect on mothers feeling more confident. The mothers reported fewer disagreements with fathers, and fathers reported less undermining that mothers took part in. And again, these are medium-sized effects. Okay, and that's an important thing, because sometimes with intervention studies, they report significant effects, but they can be small. But large effects and medium effects are really more important. Okay, so now just moving on to the pre to post and the follow-up. This was a 3-month follow-up. We see the same kinds of results at 3-month follow-up. Mothers reported more confidence, fewer disagreements, and at this point in time, mothers also reported that they were engaging in less undermining, and fathers reported that there was less undermining. Interestingly enough, these effects were large. Okay, so for instance, if you just look at mothers' report of confidence at follow-up, which is that number 3 there, they felt more confident in their ability to co-parent than they reported at pre-test, and that they reported at post-test as well. And similar results are found for these other outcomes. I'm going to skip over the quotes. You can take a look at these, but I want to leave time for our discussion here. So in conclusion, because only half of mothers are interested in a co-parenting intervention, it can be challenging to form mothers' co-parenting groups in small programs serving fathers. Also want to point out that this sort of interesting finding that it was really just the mothers who were in the moderate level of undermining that seemed to be more interested in this intervention, understanding dads. So the best prospects for engaging mothers is when they don't reside together with the father, when father has been incarcerated in the past year, when the relationship is of moderate quality, and when they share more together, such as having more children together. The understanding dads is associated with greater confidence in mother's ability to co-parent, and generally speaking, lower self-perceived conflict. And that's the case with fathers as well. They seem to perceive less conflict. Just a pattern that we observed here is that there was increased confidence, decreased conflict, but we did not see an increase in support and mothers and fathers' sense that they had a better alliance with each other. And we think that possibly that might take longer to achieve than a fairly brief intervention. In this case, the Understanding Dads is where we had 6 sessions, but it generally is 8. Just one cautionary note, there was no control group in our study, so it's not possible to say that improved co-parenting was caused by the intervention, but nevertheless, we think that our findings hold promise for this program to begin being considered an evidence-based program, but also that it should be subjected to some more rigorous studies, such as a randomized control trial. And I think that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jay. Jeff Johnson is going to help us with some reactions to this whole issue of co-parenting and fatherhood programs. So, Jeff, how are fatherhood programs trying to deal with the co-parenting issue now? What's your perception about it?
Well, let me just thank FRPN and say hello to the webinar participants for participating in this very important discussion. First of all, let me say that the issue of co-parenting and mothers and fathers working together is not new. It really dates back to some of the very first demonstration projects involving fathers. In particular, the Young Unwed Fathers Pilot Project, of 91, 93, run by PPV, and also Parents Fair Share from 1993, I think, to 1997 in terms of when the evaluation was completed. And what you find is striking, as I listened to the presentation, is the amount of discord, between a lot of the mothers and the fathers in terms of the co-parenting. And what you found in both of those studies is that the Young Unwed Fathers Pilot Project that had the younger mothers 16 to 24 were more likely to engage in a discussion about the father's involvement than the mothers involved in the Parents Fair Share program who were mothers 26 and up. I want you to think about that. The older mothers and fathers may be in the throes of an ended relationship, whereas some of the younger mothers and fathers may be involved in a beginning relationship, and it really kind of strikes of that magic moment that we talked about some years ago in terms of when to intervene with mothers and fathers. But I will say that I've seen a lot of work happening with mothers and fathers on co-parenting, some very substantial efforts right now happening in Iowa and in Virginia and in Florida. And interesting enough that the distinction that those programs have over what has been presented today is that they establish their program based on working with the mothers as an individualized group from the beginning and really branch out from there. So they have a fatherhood program, but they have a separate motherhood program. And so they're two different programs, but they complement one another. And that the same dosage of time in the programs are the same as well. Some are 16 to 32 hours for the fathers, some are 16 to 32 hours for the mothers. Because what we found, what we see, I won't say found, but what we see in some of these programs is that the mothers, in order to get them to a co-parenting conversation, she has to deal with herself. She has her own kind of personal development kind of needs. She wants to heal. She wants to be self-aware of those things that she's bringing into the relationship or that is hindering the relationship, and that those are the same types of things that the father has been bringing up as well. And so I would just say that I think that the Talbot House, in terms of some of their improvements, to me, are very spot on in terms of, where do we go from here? And I think that from what I see out there, fatherhood programs trying to do this are really trying to branch out and not just have a kind of an individualized fatherhood program, but are really trying to have a family program that really focuses in on mothers. I think that the perception of a fatherhood program is for men. And so the perception, in contrast, would be if it's a mother program, it's for her. But then the goal is to kind of get mothers and fathers working together on behalf of their children. And so I think that the end game is what we should be with is the future direction, and how do we get mothers and fathers to enter into a co-parenting relationship, an agreement, and I think that could be done by helping single parents, either moms or dads, understand more about the importance of co-parenting. But in those cases where there is a couple and they are trying to work it out, actually helping them develop a parenting plan that includes a co-parenting agreement. And I think that, but I think that working with both of the mothers and fathers individually is what I see is critical in order to get to a co-parenting conversation, because of some of the baggage that both mom and dad bring that has to be vetted out before they can kind of sit down and share their thoughts about how to work together.
So Jeff, is this a death knell for fatherhood programs as we've known them? Are we moving, would you say we'd be moving to an era of family programs and the identity or the creature of, fatherhood programs with father-specific services and it's over?
No, I don't think it's over. I think that we're growing up. I think that, there have been some, fractures in the whole fatherhood, marriage, relationship movement. And I think that what we're growing up and maturing around is the need to have all those things kind of working together to complement one another. But I will say that the relationship emphasis on fatherhood programs has always been there. I think that what we're learning is that we need to strengthen that, enhance that to include mothers in a more substantial way, in the same ways in which we try to work with fathers on his identity, where he's going with his life and his engagement with his child. Mothers have to go through something very similar in terms of what she has to do, and so I think that what we've argued over the last 30 years is that we need to include a focus on fathers, because when you define family, in many instances, the father was not included. I think we've passed that right now. And I think that we're at a point right now where a lot of father programs struggle in terms of completing their work because they can't get the type of custody and visitation arrangement with the mothers that's required. And so I think we're at that point right now. If we're going to finish the job of fatherhood, we've got to work with moms. I don't think we have an alternative, but I think it's a good thing. And so what that will mean is that as you move more towards a father and family type of approach, it means that you're probably going to be working with equal numbers of fathers and equal numbers of mothers. 100 fathers, 100 mothers, but you're working towards the end of getting them to work together on behalf of their children. Because in many respects, that's what this is all about. When I entered the work, it was all about reducing child poverty. And how do you reduce child poverty? Well, you do that by getting mothers to work together. They're sharing their financial, the emotional, and other things that are necessary in order to grow children to be healthy and happy. And I think that we're at a point right now where those things have to come together in an individualized way first, father programs, mother programs, but then they're complementary of one another in regards to trying to achieve this co-parenting goal. And I think it's an exciting time. I really think it's an exciting time for us, and I think that this is going to prove. I think the direction is good.
What do you think are the chief challenges to sort of moving in that direction? Is it slim resources that now have to be divided between mothers and fathers, or changing federal regulations about, the HMRF grants? I mean, Armin came to FRPN to fund his mother engagement study.
Well, we're working with Congress right now, trying to change some of the legislative language that allows us to work with mothers. The new pathway sites were not allowed to work, with mothers because of the language, in the legislation. And so, and I think that's something that we're going to have to deal with. I think that, when I look back at this, 20 years, 25 years ago, the mothers groups were saying the same thing about the father groups. In other words, this is money that had been advocated for, for mothers and children. Now we've been asking them to use that same dollar to work with fathers. And then what happened is that the private philanthropy, started, its investment into the fatherhood programs up until 2005, when we got the marriage and the fatherhood resources. And so it's really, a stage of development. with regards to the resources. And I think that if we can make the case to Congress that we need more resources, in order to work with mom and dad, because that's the only way we're going to reduce the child poverty line or numbers. I think Congress will understand that. But it's just the evolution of our work. I just don't see it, going in reverse. And what it's really requiring that we do is integrate what we do in such a way that works on behalf of both parents. That's going to be of the greatest benefit to the child financially, emotionally, and otherwise.
Thank you. That's okay. Very stimulating. Do we have? I'm going to repeat for the audience that if you have questions for any of the panelists and for Jeff, please type them in at the Q&A portion of the screen. And so I guess for Armin and for Jay, you sort of alluded to both that something about effect sizes. I guess how, on a practical level, what kind of differences can we realistically expect in mother behavior and the lives of father, children, based on some of these preliminary findings? And is this, should we be making policy based on this? What should we be doing?
So I can start, Armin, if you don't mind. I was rather surprised about how large the effects were, especially at follow-up for mothers who participated in Understanding Dads. Oftentimes you don't find interventions have a large effect size, particularly in the social behavioral area. The effect size tend to be on the small to medium size. But I do just want to caution folks that we had no control group. So the fact that we had a large effect size needs to be taken into consideration in light of we don't know how parents who, let's say, did not receive the intervention might have changed as well, just as a result of passage of time. So that's a cautionary note. But I think, research is an evolutionary kind of thing, and when you find studies that are more preliminary, that are showing large effect sizes, that's suggestive of going to the next step, which is to explore further and to be more rigorous in one's research. And so I think that's warranted here. I'm not sure that this has a direct linkage to policy implications at this point, but it should be helpful information.
Armin, you had, I think I cut you off before you could talk about this, but you mentioned on one of your slides that you have a follow-up study of unmarried, non-romantically involved, effective co-parents that's currently underway. You want to elaborate on that? Is that something you're doing or something else we should know about?
Yes. Can you hear me, Jessica?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so again, just to follow up and respond to the first question, our effects were small. But again, keep in mind that our intervention was literally one workshop. And so again, I think to Jay's point, the findings from the projects today, I think if nothing else, certainly can serve as a springboard to whatever is next in terms of moving the work and advancing the state of knowledge. And so certainly these are indeed integral pieces in that regard, I think. As far as the project that you mentioned that we have ongoing, one of the things we're looking to do now is sort of take what it is that we've learned from this project and say, okay, well, how is it that we can go to whatever the next step is? And for me, just this notion, this idea of empathy and the role that it plays in co-parenting, I think is something that is really, really critical. And so what I'm doing now is I am actively recruiting non-married parents who do not have a romantic relationship. So these are folks who their only tie to one another is the fact that they have a child, right? But somehow, some way are able to move beyond all of the challenges that I and my co-panelists talked about today, so that they can do what we all know is important, which is focus and emphasize doing whatever it is they have to do to promote their children's safe and healthy growth and development. And sitting down with those folks to figure out what strategies they're putting in place, what experiences they've had, what challenges have they had to overcome in order to get to a place where they're able and willing to do that, and then distill down from those experiences what is it that other folks might be able to put in place, and what is it that practitioners and policymakers and other folks interested and concerned with this work might be able to take away from that so as to inform whatever it is that they're doing in their corners of the world around co-parenting and ultimately fatherhood. So that study, it only recently started a few months ago, and so we're still actively sort of recruiting and so on and so forth.
Great.
But stay tuned for results on that.
Stay tuned. And Kim, well, I wonder if you can react a little bit to what Jeff's talked about sort of the evolution of fatherhood programs, where it might be going. How did the staff react to the findings you have and the idea of being more potentially more family-oriented and engaging of women? And any take on that?
Sure. I mean, they conceptually were on board with the idea of becoming more family-focused, not just because of the results of the study, but because the overarching strategic plan for our agency is really emphasizing more service integration across the board. And so they understand the value of that. What they didn't want to lose, which Jeff also alluded to, was the father focus of those services, because they do feel that really serves a unique need for dads who often feel like there aren't services out in the community that focus just on them. And so what we talked about was not dissolving the father-focused services, but rather re-engineering to where the Fatherhood Project can still exist as a father-focused program, but maybe within that larger umbrella of family-focused services, like a family center. They could still have the Fatherhood Project, may have some mother-specific stuff, may have some other types of services that are across the board for both men and women, such as medical or concrete assistance or legal aid, but something that draws both genders in the door independently so that we can then potentially work with the mother, not have the dad be the conduit in terms of being able to engage her, but to be able to truly fully meet their needs and have more of a sort of a holistic array of services. That's what was initially discussed, but what goes into re-engineering that is actually, a pretty tall order in terms of, physical space, what types of services, who's the payer source for all those services. Smaller organizations aren't going to be as nimble at being able to diversify funding as maybe some of the larger, more decentralized organizations. But looking at all of that, how do you triage and coordinate all that? How do you staff it? So it's a re-engineering to do that is not a small project, but it was something that I think garnered at least some active discussion and some excitement among staff about, is there a way to do this differently?
Thank you. Well, we've used up our time. Thank you for all for joining. The slides and the tape recording will be posted on FRPN.org. And stay tuned. We'll be conducting another FRPN webinar at the end of October, beginning of November, and we hope to see you then. Thanks to the panelists, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a wonderful day.